All right, so the next one here, Senator Murphy says USAID funds freedom fighters. So Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut touted the role of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, in meddling in the affairs of other countries during a rally outside the USAID's headquarters in Washington on Monday. So there was a pro-USAID rally where all the bureaucrats showed up. And so Murphy said, quote, USAID chases China all around the world, making sure that China doesn't monopolize contracts for critical minerals and port infrastructure all around the world. It supports freedom fighters everywhere in the world up until yesterday, delivering firewood to the brave Ukrainian defenders on the Eastern Front, end quote. So Murphy also criticized Elon Musk's role in the Trump administration's pause in USAID's activity and suggested it was related to his business dealings in China. Murphy said China is cheering these actions. So this is interesting because most USAID defenders kind of try to portray the agency as an aid organization that only helps to kind of give people in need aid. But obviously that's very far from the truth of what USAID actually is. And Murphy's comments are a rare acknowledgement of its destabilizing activities across the world. And then when I was writing this article kind of got away from me because I ended up getting into how Murphy was involved in the Maidan protests and the 2014 coup in Ukraine that led to the crisis that we see today. Because in Ukraine, leading up to 2014, the U.S., through USAID, through the National Endowment of Democracy, funded all of these NGOs, civil society groups, and media outlets in Ukraine. And this all helped foment and organize, these protests. Infamously, I should say, Victoria Nuland in 2013 said that the U.S. invested over $5 billion in these efforts since Ukraine became an independent state in 1991. And Murphy went to the Maidan and he spoke alongside John McCain. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And they were also joined on stage by Ola Tianibok, who's a leader of the Svoboda Party, which is one of these far-right political parties. Far-right, that term is used too much these days, but this is a party that has its neo-Nazi roots, and this is who he's on stage with. And Scott Horton, in his book Provoked, I just put in an excerpt from his book about this, because after the coup in 2014, Murphy was bragging, saying that the U.S. was very much involved. He said, quote, with respect to Ukraine, we did not sit on the sidelines. We have been very much involved. The members of the Senate who have been there, members of the State Department who have been on the square, the Obama administration has passed sanctions. The Senate was prepared to pass its own set of sanctions. It was certain the clear position of the United States has in part been what has helped lead to this change in regime. I think if ultimately this is a peaceful transition to a new government in Ukraine, it'll be the United States on the streets of Ukraine who will be seen as a great friend in helping make this transition happen, end quote. And he actually called it a regime change and said, this was all us. So, people try to say this was not a U.S.-backed thing. It's just completely absurd. So I figured this Murphy's little speech at the USAID rally was a good time to highlight all that stuff.
The European Union cut off trade talks with Ukraine today, saying the former Soviet republic's terms have, quote, no grounds in reality. That development fired up protesters in the capital city of Kiev, who were joined this afternoon by Republican Senator John McCain of Arizona and Democrat Chris Murphy of Connecticut. They told the crowd of more than 200,000 that Americans support their resistance. Protesters want closer ties to Europe, not Russia.